Now, King David was one of the most important characters in the Bible and also in the Old Testament. He's regarded as one of Israel's most beloved kings and a man after God's own heart, and he's shown that many times in his life. Now, as a boy, David was just a shepherd. He tended to his flock and he took care of his sheep, and in that process, he tried to honor God to the best of his ability. Now, during that time in the country of Israel, there was another king named King Saul, and King Saul had not honored God, and in turn, God didn't want King Saul to be king anymore, and he decided to send the prophet Samuel to anoint King David as the rightful king of Israel. Now, shortly after this, and during this time in Israel, there was a battle going on between the Israelites and a neighboring people named the Philistines. And fighting for the Philistines was a man named Goliath. And Goliath was a giant. He was absolutely huge, and he was a great warrior. And nobody really wanted to fight Goliath because he had marched out for 40 days, and he had said that if somebody struck him down, the Philistines would admit defeat and be taken prisoners. But if he struck one of the Israelites down, they would all be going into captivity. And so the Israelites, they didn't know what to do for 40 days. And eventually, David came to check in on his brothers who were fighting in the battle. They were soldiers. And David, only being a teenager, he decided that he would go against Goliath and fight him. Now, nobody took David seriously. Nobody believed him. After all, how could a teenage boy fight and win against a giant and a warrior who's been fighting all his life like Goliath? Now, David had something up his sleeve that nobody else anticipated, and that was his trust in God. And so David, what he did was he took stones from the stream after convincing everybody that he would go and fight Goliath, and they let him. And he put those stones in his slingshot, and he fired them at Goliath's head. And Goliath, of course, was struck in the head, and he was beaten and he was killed by David. Now, afterwards, David celebrated by taking Goliath's sword and taking Goliath's head for himself. Now, when this happened, David became very, very popular in Israel, and the king who was already king of Israel, King Saul, he didn't like this. In fact, he became very jealous, and he actually wanted to kill David because of his popularity. And so Saul tried many times to kill David, except that none of those times really worked because David had trusted God. Now, when Saul was chasing David and trying to kill him, David actually, in the process, wrote the book of Psalms, which is a dedication to his heartfelt love for God, and it shows how much he trusted God during those times. Now, after King Saul's death, much later, David was finally the rightful king of Israel, and he was able to rule over the land just as Saul had before him. And David tried to honor God throughout his rule and bring the country of Israel closer to God overall. However, David wasn't without imperfections and sin, just as all of us aren't. And in the process, David became jealous over another man's wife, his friend Uriah's wife named Bathsheba. And in fact, he became so jealous of Bathsheba that since Uriah was a soldier, when he was out, David committed adultery with Bathsheba and she became pregnant. Now, David tried to cover this up when Uriah came back, although it didn't work, and then afterwards decided to have Uriah sent to the front lines so that he would be killed and nobody would find out about what David had done. However, God always knew what David was doing, and after that had happened, after Uriah was killed, David was not only guilty of adultery, but he was also guilty of murder. And so God sent the prophet Nathan to confront David about this and bring him to a stage of repentance. This resulted in David's son that he bore with Bathsheba to be killed. And also, this marked a turning point in David's life. He admitted his sins to God and asked for forgiveness. And God, being faithful, granted this to David. Now, even though this wasn't an easy lesson for David, he lived the rest of his life as a king after God's own heart and is still remembered as that today. David had many sons, including King Solomon, but most importantly, in fact, Jesus descended from David's bloodline, which is probably the most amazing part of the story. Even though David wasn't without faults, and he wasn't perfect, he still tried to live out God's life for him according to God's plan. And he tried to honor God in all the decisions he made and how he treated others. This is probably one of the most important things about David, and that's what makes him so remarkable in the Bible.